Sean todos muy bienvenidos a esta nueva edición de Diálogo Piensa. Va a ser muy especial porque vamos a hablar en particular en parte sobre un proyecto que hemos venido desarrollando en Fundación Piensa, que acá tengo de hecho el informe, se llama Chile Dialoga, un proyecto que realizamos en conjunto con la Universidad Estatal de Ohio y en particular con el Centro IDEA, que contempló, digamos, en el contexto del segundo proceso constituyente, que 3.500 ciudadanos participaran en instancias deliberativas, en particular con 4 convencionales constituyentes, consejeros constituyentes en este caso. Y la verdad es que funcionó súper bien. Los resultados ya los hemos estado compartiendo desde hace algunos días y ustedes pueden también ingresar a nuestra página web y revisar también esos resultados. Muy interesante, se los digo. Y bueno, y tenemos el orgullo de poder conversar en esta oportunidad con quien es full profesor de la Universidad Estatal de Ohio y además el director y fundador del Centro IDEA, que es quien está haciendo, digamos, estas instancias deliberativas no solo en Chile, sino que en distintas partes del mundo. Michael Neblo, profesor Michael Neblo. Thank you so much for being here, professor.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you to the foundation and this partnership, and it's just wonderful being in Chile.
Okay, so vamos a conversar sobre este proyecto en particular, pero muchas otras cosas. Ahora voy a cambiar al inglés para tener esta conversación. So, professor,
yes.
I will start with a very quite open questions.
Sure.
Because we know that you are working in different projects and you have different interests, but one of them, we were talking with the audience, is these deliberative processes that you are like doing, developing in different countries in the world.
Yes.
Can you explain us a little bit about these deliberative instances? Because maybe the audience doesn't have an idea of this project.
Sure. So the idea behind the deliberative town halls are the main new practice or institution that we've been working with, but they're inspired by a more theoretical development that I did in my work before then. And I call that theoretical development directly representative democracy. And in a way, it sounds paradoxical because normally we think of there's direct democracy and representative democracy, and they're to be contrasted, not combined. And the idea behind directly representative democracy is that in most democracies these days, the way representative democracy has evolved in practice is that if you want to have influence in the process, you must work through parties or interest groups. Regular citizens who just want to understand something or have their voice heard or get an account from their elected officials, there are really no good opportunities to access the political system. And that we have quite a bit of evidence in many countries causes tremendous frustration. And in many countries, especially Latin America, there's a tradition of more direct or participatory democracy as a response to that. And you know, in Latin America, you know, that's a long-standing tradition, and there appears to be more enthusiasm. In many other countries, actually, citizens don't really want many more burdens for direct decision-making. They will do it, but they will only do it because they think the alternative is bad. That corrupt elites are out of touch and that they have to step in and do this. But if there was an alternative where they're respectfully consulted ahead of decision-making, and then they're given accounts afterwards as individuals who have moral standing to access democracy without going through a party, without going through an interest group, and just asking for an explanation and understanding the issues on their own terms and communicating their needs, wants, and interests and perspectives. In many, many cases, they're willing to give decision-making authority back to elected representatives. Yeah. They want the decision, they want the control, but then they will give it back if they feel comfortable with it. And directly representative democracy is designed to facilitate that.
So, as I understood, it's not just about talk on politics. I mean, we have a lot of experience here in Chile and Latin America with some participation mechanism when we put like the citizens to speak together. But here is like a very key element on this vertical deliberation process. I mean, we have to interaction, you know, with our elected authorities. Is this a key element on this process?
It absolutely is. In the early part of my career in my research, I focused on horizontal deliberation among citizens. And I think there is a role for that. I think it's a good thing. I don't want it to go away. But one of the things that we noticed is that there was a difficulty transferring what was learned and understood and the legitimacy that gets generated by those citizen deliberations into decision making. So that happens in civil society, it happens among citizens, but then there's the problem of that influencing the formal political system. And unless you have a specific way to transfer that information and influence, it usually just evaporated. It just went away. And that made citizens frustrated because they invested this time and energy and engaged and then saw nothing come of it.
Yeah.
And part of the problem was that elected officials truly didn't quite know what to do with it. They often didn't know about it, or it wasn't linked to their jurisdiction. It was a national phenomenon and didn't speak to what their constituency wanted and needed. And so the idea behind deliberative town halls is not that it fixes everything, but that it fills a very specific but extremely important gap in how deliberation has worked so far that allows us to get that that citizen deliberation into the decision-making process in a more direct and robust sort of way. And it turns out the citizens love it and the elected officials love it. They're responsive to it. So that's what we're going for in deliberative town halls.
Professor, I know that you're not going to say this, but your work is like impacting the whole world, not just Chile and United States. You're working in different countries, in Africa, in Oceania, in Europe, now in South America with Chile. So I would like to know if you notice some difference between these different contexts.
Yes.
I assume that it's not the same.
It is not, and that's been a very important experience. I knew that we needed to understand local context, which is why we always work with local experts, local partners, and ensa has been a fantastic and essential partner in the Chilean context. And yes, there are pretty significant variations. I guess I would group them into three. So Nigeria has been its own, so we've only done one country in Africa, but we might do more. But Nigeria has been its own very distinct sort of process. And actually Chile has been quite distinct too. And then the other countries we've worked with, there are some variations, but they're closer to each other, largely because they're in the Anglosphere. So it's been Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, the United States. We've done a little bit of partner work in Canada and Australia. And those political traditions and cultural backgrounds are, there's distinctions, but they're more similar to each other than, say, the Chilean case or the Nigerian case. In the Chilean case, I think the biggest difference is that there is a long tradition in Latin America of participatory democracy. So citizens are used to, and to some extent expect, and don't find it radically new to be given participatory opportunities in a way that's like in Nigeria.
This is a whole
they can't believe this is happening.
Yeah.
Right. It's utterly new. My understanding is in Chile, there's a certain amount of fatigue. They get asked perhaps too much sometimes on their views or to participate. I don't want to overstate that.
But then we leave this process and it's different.
That's right. And I think that there's a certain amount of satisfaction on that because there's a direct interaction with decision makers and more confidence that the work is going to have an influence, but it's not all on the citizens' responsibility because there are certain policy issues. There are certain policy issues, in my view, where direct democracy works quite well. But we live in a large, Chile is a populous, complex country with a modern economy in a global context. And some policy questions are really quite challenging for the average citizen to fully solve on their own, right? They can set the agenda, they can talk about their priorities, they can share their experiences, they can assess what the officials have done after the fact, but literally crafting policy, in some cases, I think is asking too much and is a burden citizens might not want. For more straightforward issues that don't require much technical expertise, I think direct and participatory mechanisms can work quite well, but there's others where it really doesn't work very well. And deliberation around those, I think citizens don't have the confidence that it's making a difference. And so the vertical deliberation gives them much more confidence that when they're engaging more complicated policy issues that they can't manage entirely on their own, their contributions are still going to matter, and that they will get an account back that will help them assess how the process worked. Right. And so I think that even in the Latin American context, there's a real role for deliberative town halls.
Okay. Professor, I would like to move more into the motivation of these deliberative processes. Mm-hmm. Because some scholars used to argue that we are that our liberal institutions or the liberal democracy is under risk, that we are facing different challenges, polarization or anti-establishment narratives, populism as well. Yes. So do you agree with this general diagnostic of polycrisis that we're living?
Yes and no. So yes, in that I do believe many democracies around the world are moving towards crisis. No, in that I think the origins and nature of the crisis are partially misunderstood. For example, there's a lot of talk about the erosion of commitment to democracy and democratic norms among democratic citizens. And I originally, I thought that I just took this for granted. I accepted what other scholars had said about this. But as I looked into it more carefully, I realized something. At least in the US context, all of the evidence for this declining commitment to democratic norms is ambiguous. You can't tell whether it's two very different phenomena. One is actually a loosening of commitment to democratic norms. Another one, but norms always have exceptions attached to them. Even in the United States, and many Americans don't even know this, Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the greatest icon, the greatest representative of American constitutional democracy, and I think correctly so. Right before the Civil War, there was sabotage all over in the North from Southern sympathizers who wanted to disable the Northern states from being able to mount a war against the South. And so Lincoln had a lot of the saboteurs arrested. And in the American political tradition, there's a very powerful, long-standing legal norm called habeas corpus. Show me the body. You can't detain somebody for more than a very short period of time without going to a court and explaining the evidence and reasons why you're detaining this person. Well, in this context, too many people got detained too fast and there weren't enough lawyers and Justice Department officials to process it. And so Lincoln, and so the prisoners, the detainees, went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, you're right, release them. And Lincoln said no. He defied the court. Right? Now that is, it turns out, the way it's measured, loss of democratic norms, commitment to democratic norms, defying a Supreme Court and supporting an executive that you like to defy a Supreme Court is the single most diagnostic issue of democratic backsliding, right? Or loss of commitment to democratic norms. But the point is, all norms have exceptions. Lincoln allowed lawyers and people to observe the prisoners. He said that it was going to be temporary just until he could hire enough lawyers to process it. And so he went to Congress and asked for authorization. So he took many, many precautions to not be abusive, but he did defy the court, right? Okay, here's what I think has happened. I think that populists, by and large, but beyond populists, because of communication technology, no longer can directly appeal to their supporters and convince them that there's a crisis, that we're in a state of exception, that you need to let me do extraordinary things. And if that's the case, citizens haven't changed their support for democratic norms at all. They're just much more prone to think that the barbarians are at the gate, the republic is about to fall, and we needed emergency power. Now, some people say, oh, well, that doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference. Norms take a generation to change. False beliefs, while not easy to change, are much easier to manage than norms. Norms are a massive cultural long-term issue. And millions and millions of dollars in the United States are going to shoring up democratic norms. And I fear that all of our efforts are directed the wrong way.
Yeah. So let's talk just a little bit about this influence of new technologies, because you mentioned that. We used to have this idea of the bad aspect of new technologies. We were talking about this, how these new technologies may influence the echo chamber phenomena, or maybe the polarization, not just ideological, but also affective polarization. So we used to have this diagnostic, but do you have maybe another vision about this? How we can use the new technologies for good?
Yes. I very much do. And actually, I'll take one step back. Initially, there was massive optimism about technology. It was going to unleash democracy and realize the long-term goals of democracy. Of course, that didn't work out as expected. And then I think, in a sense, the attitudes went too far the other way, and deep pessimism and skepticism set in. And here's the sense in which I think both perspectives are not adequate. In general, in political science, I have this new little thing that I'm very focused on, that I think that political scientists are often captured by what I call the tyranny of the actual, meaning we do a study and say, oh, technology isn't working for democracy. It can't work. Let's move on to something else. Instead of asking, what about how we're using technology? What about the institutions around technology? What about the larger parts of the political and deliberative system are causing technology not to work the way that we had hoped and thought it would? And what can we do to change that and redirect it into a better, more constructive form? And that's exactly the idea behind deliberative town halls. Right? Deliberative town halls allow certain things that we couldn't do before. So the disintermediation, that not having to go through standard media and being able to retreat into echo chambers, is part of what's been difficult about technology. But there are other opportunities too. It creates opportunities for directly representative democracy, for elected officials to directly engage their constituents in a way that was simply impossible before. Another example, Chile is a very geographically distinct, long country with the center and the north and the south. If you are doing in-person deliberative forums or consultations, it's simply impractical to get people from the different regions together to talk directly. And we know that if you have such direct engagement, you can get past, you're much more likely to get past misunderstandings, distrust, and understand each other better.
Actually, this is a very good point, because not just because of the whole country, but even when we talk about regions, specific regions. I mean, we just like worked in a project when we showed that people who live in some like marginalized territories, tends to feel that because of the internet, they can't influence politics.
Yes.
So this is like a new frame in how we understand the digital divide.
Yes.
So this is very similar to what you were talking
about. So I think it's a different facet of it, but it is the same thing, right? So one of them is merely that when we were very focused on geography, certain people had geographic disadvantages, right, to access the system. That's one issue, and it's a very important issue. Another is creating connections between geographically separate groups.
Can I ask you, because let's talk about Chile, just a little bit.
Yes,
I know that you're not a Latin American.
Very far from my competence, yes.
But just as an introduction, we're facing very big issues because of our centralism, our territorial concentration. And I make this distinction because it's not just about administrative duties that we have. It is more about like economic concentration, social concentration, political concentration in terms of the political power. So all of these things obviously affect political engagement.
Yes.
How can we face this territorial marginalization? And I will just give you one example. Because of our survey, we noticed that in the last two constituent process, people who live in these marginalized territories tend to feel more negative feelings toward the constituent process, both of them. I know that you know that the first one was led by the left wing, and the second one was led by the right wing. The only variable that explains the negative feelings toward both of them is the territorial one.
Yeah.
So how can we face this territorial marginalization?
Well, this is, in a sense, this is, where I think we can, if we're creative about deploying technology, it can actually help. I want to make sure I can do this quickly, but there's a congressman in the United States who, just an odd coincidence, was a student of mine. And we've reconnected, and he wrote a book, and he represents Silicon Valley. He represents the center of the technology industry in the United States. And very interestingly, he wrote a book saying, why does everybody have to live in Silicon Valley? The whole point of technology is that we can do this anywhere. And we could get over the divides and the resentment in other parts of the United States towards the elites, say in Silicon Valley and the tech companies, if we distributed some of the jobs, the good quality jobs in the economic development and the opportunities afforded by technological revolutions, by leveraging and organizing the technology differently, to consciously develop policy to spread it around. And not only does it do that, it stops brain drain. I don't know if this is a phrase in Spanish, but it's the phenomenon that, and I would be very surprised if it's not true in Chile, that in the North and the South, if you're a very talented student, right, you go to university in Santiago, and then you never go back. Right?
Yeah, we have the same phrase.
Yes. Okay. And Congressman Khanna, his name is Ro Khanna, and Congressman Khanna says, in addition to all the other sorts of things, it would prevent brain drain, which has its own economic goods, but also has social goods. It maintains the integrity of these communities and doesn't selectively disintegrate them, which causes a lot of the resentment.
Actually, there are cities, big cities, capital cities in the south of the country, where the 95% of the good students used to go to Santiago and they never come back.
Yes.
95% of the students.
Yes.
So this is very tragic.
And it happens in the United States. And coincidentally, I was in Italy over the summer, and my grandfather came from Italy, and I went back, and he was from a teeny little hill town outside of Naples. That's kind of the equivalent of the South, right? It's remote from Rome and Florence and Milan. And it just so happens that the mayor was a former prime minister many years ago. And before that, he was the minister of basically development of the poor regions. That's how he became prime minister. So he's been very focused on helping the disadvantaged geographic regions stay strong.
Yeah.
And so I went and interviewed him about brain drain in Italy. It's the exact same thing. And actually in Italy, it's more similar to Chile because it's a very vertical country with big concentrated centers, urban centers, and the rural areas, especially in the South, completely lose all of their best students, and it holds them back economically and politically.
That's true. Actually, this is one of the explanation of these like populist movements that
absolutely.
Italy.
And so I think Congressman Khanna's, I'm very embarrassed, I'm forgetting the name of his book, but I recommend it greatly because I don't think it's just for the United States. I think and he's a very sophisticated, he discusses Habermas in the book, but in an accessible way. And his proposals are designed around the United States, but I think they have very clear lessons in them for every country that faces this, which frankly is most countries.
Yeah.
Most as urbanization, attracts industry, and this is a process happening in many, many countries.
Yeah.
And I think it's behind the populist backlash, which is oftentimes rooted in rural, or at least economically, like Naples isn't rural, but it's economically disadvantaged, and they still have drain because people don't want to stay there. So yes.
So, Professor, one last question.
Sure.
About Chile. We were talking about this, but in Chile, in the region of Valparaiso, we have two soccer teams, football teams, we say. One is Everton, and the other is Everton is from Viña, and Wanderers is from Valparaiso. I'm from Viña, so I'm a fan of Everton.
Yes.
But to be honest, most of the time I feel more like anti-Wanderino.
Yes.
So this is just a joke. I mean, I have very good friends from that are fans from Wander, but these negative identities are very important in Latin America.
Yes.
And there are different scholars that say that this is one of the big phenomena in the political partyism in Latin America. So most of the time we feel more represented, not because of our affinity to or sympathy toward a political party, but more because of our antipathy to other political parties. Is this a problem, and how can we face this issue?
I'm so glad you asked that. I think it is first of all, it's an increasingly important problem outside of Latin America. My understanding is that it's a long-standing problem in Latin America. I don't think, there's always been some of it everywhere, right? Yeah. But I think there's been an enormous surge in the global north, in the United States in particular, along these lines. It's relatively new, and both from a political theory standpoint and historical and empirical standpoint, it's a very serious problem. It's poisonous to democracy. The key to a healthy functioning democracy is that we see the people on the other side as rivals or opponents, not enemies. Once we begin to regard the other people as enemies, rather than people who disagree with us, that we have to, and we'll struggle for getting our policies. That's politics, right? We're not going to make that go away, right? But taking pleasure in you don't get anything good out of it. You're merely causing pain or defeat or marginalization to another group. That is political poison. And it has spiked dramatically in the United States. And I have a graduate student who's writing a dissertation on this, and we think we have some good evidence as to how it's happening. In my own view, it turns out this is a really important final question, because I think it's at the root. It's the first billiard ball, the first action that set off the chain reaction that has led to the crisis of global democracy, or global crisis of democracy. And that is radical misunderstandings and misattributions about what other people think and what they think about me. And we have evidence in the United States. We have various statements about, we ask, let's say, Democrats what the Republicans think about something, and then what Republicans think about them. By a factor of 5, they quintuple the perception of negative attributions for what's real. 5 times more. It's a different reality that they're living in.
Yep.
Of course, under those circumstances, they don't trust them. If they don't trust them, that leads to suspicion, that leads to an oppositional posture. And that's where the poison of negative identity and antipathy rather than value to me seeps in, and our rivals become enemies. And we need to interrupt that process. And actually, I think deliberative town halls are an effective, to bring it back, way to do that, because in these town halls, they see their fellow citizens that they think have these crazy ideas that are hostile, saying things that they might disagree with, but that aren't crazy, in being respectful, and engaging in perfectly normal ways.
Actually, you have some evidence regarding affective polarization. I know that this is a different concept, but it's like kind of related.
It's quite related, actually. It's slightly different, yes. So affective polarization, polarization traditionally meant the left and the right can agree on nothing about what to do, right? And that's a problem, but that's politics. To some extent, we've always faced that. And if it gets to be too much, it can become a problem. But my own view is that that's just something that needs to be managed. It's not something that needs to be stopped, right? It can't be stopped. Politics has conflict. People are going to disagree, right? But in the United States, something, I forget the numbers, I don't want to quote it, but there's been like a quadrupling in the number of people who say they would be angry or upset if their son or daughter married somebody from the other party. Right? This used to be no big deal. They want to marry a Republican, they want to marry a Democrat. If they love them, that's great. Now they don't want to go to the wedding. That's crazy. That's poison for political society, right? And it's rooted in misattribution, I think, and misperception. And we really need to interrupt it. And if there are lessons, Chile perhaps has been wrestling with this longer than the United States. So I'm very open to learning from how other countries have managed this problem, because it's a very serious one. Now, in our case, we did find, you alluded to this, we did a study recently where we had one Democrat and one Republican. It was a slightly different deliberative town hall where there were people from both sides together, and it was a national sample. And we didn't design it to reduce affective polarization, but we tested for it. In merely seeing 2 people from the different parties disagree, they disagreed on many things, but did so respectfully. They explained why. They talked about the things they could agree on. They talked about how to resolve fair ways of figuring out where they couldn't agree, how to come to a decision. And then they saw their fellow citizens not acting crazy, asking reasonable questions, behaving normally. And afterwards, it was a random trial. So we had a treatment and control, and a pre and a post. And beforehand, everybody looked like the country, and there was no difference between treatment and control. Afterwards, the people who participated in this and watched it or engaged in it, it was as if affective polarization went back 31 years in the United States. And this was 2 weeks later. It's not like we hung up the phone and tested them. 2 weeks. In social, that doesn't sound like a long time. In social psychology, that's actually quite a bit.
Yes.
That's extraordinary. And there were 1,600 people, 1,600 people in it.
I know that we don't have time, but this is a very good story because it's not just about the final agreement. It's the whole process that matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as far as we know, this is in the United States anyway, this is the largest documented reduction in affective polarization of over 100 interventions that people have tried.
Professor, thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic experience. Thank you to Piensa and to you and to the people who will engage with us on this.
Ok, y para toda la audiencia, muchas gracias por acompañarnos y espero que también nos puedan acompañar en una serie de otros diálogos que vamos a ir teniendo en el futuro. No se olviden de revisar, por cierto, el trabajo del profesor Neblo, pero también el estudio que acabamos de hacer. Como les dije, se llama Chile Dialoga, en donde realizamos este experimento precisamente a propósito del segundo proceso constitucional, con excelentes resultados y muy interesantes también outputs. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.